Welcome to Bible Reader Companion. Our Bible reading this week is Galatians chapters 5 and 6, as well as Ephesians, the entire book, chapters 1 through 6, and the book of Philippians, chapters 1 and 2. And our memory verse this week is taken from Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 11, which says, "Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." As we think about this spiritual battle, and protecting ourselves with the armor of God, I want us to consider Galatians chapter 5, beginning in verse 16. Galatians 5, beginning in verse 16. The Apostle Paul says, "I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh, and these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another." You know, it's interesting that so often when Paul talks about the spiritual battle that we face, when he talks about who we need to be, he presents both a negative side and a positive side. He tells us the things that we need to not be and the things that we need to be. And there's this contrast, and it's this conflict between the flesh and the spirit. And this is not talking about, as some would have us to believe, an inherent nature of man that is totally depraved, that wants to do evil. It's simply the basic battle between that which we desire to do and that which, as we've learned and as we've allowed ourselves to satisfy ourselves, versus satisfying the will of God. And he provides this, and he talks about this and this conflict that takes place. But in so doing, he provides some very specific examples of what it is we're to avoid, these works of the flesh. And one of the interesting things in here in verse 21, as he talks about all these things, we may look at a lot of those things and say, you know, I'm not like any of those things. And there's none of those things that I could check box and say I'm one of those things. But what about in verse 21 where he says, and the like? You know, he throws this in there and he says, look, anything that's like that is part of these works of the flesh. And so sometimes we try to justify ourselves, much as the Pharisees did, by saying, well, we're adhering to this very fine letter of the law. But if we want to know how we avoid those things, just look at what we ought to be striving for. And that is in verse 22, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. You know, being who we need to be and winning the spiritual battle is not just about not being negative, in the sense that it's not just a matter of avoiding all the, as we might say, thou shalt nots. It's also about growing to be the kind of person that we ought to be. Winning the battle is not just about avoiding things. It's also about growing into things. So when you think about this, as we do this, as we fight this spiritual battle, that we keep in mind that not only must we be avoiding as we grow, but we must be growing in spiritual things and becoming more of what God would have us to be. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Thank you for thinking on these things, and we hope you'll join us again tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook for more content like this.